So I'll just say a few things real quickly about Jenny, and then we can just launch into this. So she is the expert in this area, right? I'm a user. I'm really a student. A lot of what I've learned in this area, I've learned from Jenny. We came to Berkeley as faculty at exactly the same time, right? It was 1993. You were coming from Northwestern. Yeah. Jenny was coming from Northwestern. I was coming from Columbia. My first job out of graduate school was in Columbia. We'd both been working as assistant professors at other places. She got her PhD at Berkeley. I got my undergrad at Berkeley, so we both knew Berkeley well. Anyways, from then on, we've just interacted a lot. So I'm an economist. We're from totally different fields. But the more I got to know what she worked on, the more exciting it seemed to me. And then anyways, we'll get into this. I just love the stuff that she has done. So if I may ask the first question, this is going to be very much a two-sided thing because we're going to have some fun with it, all right? But I'll kick off if I may. And so maybe you could just go back to the beginning. What was it about this area of doing research on how leaders set culture? Why did you start your intellectual life there?
That's actually a good question. It wasn't on my briefing.
I want to make sure you
I don't
do
know
it.
if I'm on.
Yeah, that might do it.
Oh, okay, green.
Good.
It's better than red. Got it. Thank you. My first foray into it was to recognize that what organizational culture is about is really differentiating one organization from another. And my initial road in was this kind of realization that people could have the same job, identical job, and be ecstatically happy in one organization and miserable at another organization. Same job. Why is that? Well, it led me to realize that organizations adopt kind of a personality, if you will, and that personality affects how people behave, what they prioritize, what they care about, how they interact with one another. And furthermore, I got sort of more serious about it, and we were able to sort of figure out the effects of culture on an organization's ability to execute on its strategy and then ultimately on its bottom line performance. And here was I'm a psychologist by training, social psychologist by training. Here was a psychological element that was driving bottom line financial success. And I believed that we were leaving unaccounted this kind of ethereal notion of organizational culture. So it became sort of my lifelong quest to figure out ways to quantify and understand culture so that managers, leaders would be in a position to be much more deliberate about culture rather than become victims of a culture that evolved without them driving it first.
And that's one of the things I love. So she's got a paper called Leading by Leveraging Culture. It's my absolute favorite. Part of what's neat about it is that it says that, culture is a tool, it's an instrument, it's how leaders get done, one of the ways that the leaders get done what they want to get done. And it says, and here are the levers. In other words, you read it and it's very practical. It's like, oh yeah, that is a lever, isn't it? And so, as you think about those levers for getting this stuff done, I mean, at the beginning you must have just had some sense that they were there. Now you've seen them, you've worked with leaders that use these various levers, huh?
Well, and here's our textbook case. Rich is a living example of sort of practicing what we preach. We wrote this case together about the defining leader principles, and it came out of a lunch that we had a number of months ago where it just seemed clear that the defining leader principles and Rich's work on leveraging culture within the Haas School is part of our history. And we really needed to sort of figure out what it looked like. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is sort of what has surprised me about writing the case and exploring how the evolution of culture has worked in a business school setting. I usually study it in corporations. And one of the things I realized is that it looks pretty much the same, right? And the levers that you used and the things that Rich has insisted on within the school are exactly the things that drive an effective culture within other organizations. How you select people. So our admissions practices are now full of sort of connections to the defining leader principles. If any of your friends or relatives or children apply to the Haas school, they need to figure out what the defining leader principles are, because they're going to have to write a couple essays about how they relate to them, right? And this is sort of the number one principle of establishing a culture is attracting the people who resonate with those cultural attributes already, right? Because they're going to come in already interested and relating to that culture. We do a bunch of stuff when people arrive, sort of how we develop people, how we train people on the staff level, on the faculty level. We reward people. We have these lovely, we're together at the executive MBA graduation this last Saturday. And the executive MBA students have a tradition where they award the Defining Leader Principle Award, 4 of them, to the person who represents each of the 4 defining principles. Question the status quo, confidence without attitude. And then they have this lovely 5th principle, which is for the person who demonstrates all of them. And it's incredible to watch the level of admiration and affection the students have for those of their colleagues who really exemplify these defining leader principles. And you see it in action. And it's just, I don't know about you, it's my favorite part of what we do. I know we have some Embas here in the audience. It's just a wonderful moment to sort of see how the students honor each other for these values that they have internalized and care deeply about.
Absolutely. And you also, so when you think about some of the companies that you've worked specifically with, why is setting strong value-creating cultures so hard? I mean, I think part of why people are so dubious about it is that it's really hard to do. It often doesn't work so well. So what are some of the things that make it so hard?
The first thing I say to that is it's actually not as hard as you think, right? I mean, not to downplay all of the tremendous effort you've put into it, but I think there's this myth out there that it is so hard to change culture and it takes so long and it costs so much. And, I actually think that's a set of myths put together by the consulting industry. No doubt, right? And there is some truth about that because you're talking about human behavior and people are sort of naturally more focused on what they already do well rather than wanting to change and try something risky and different. But in fact, the key to successful culture change is being deliberate about it. That's really the key. It is not rocket science. It is literally not rocket science. But if you are systematic and committed, if you anoint yourself as the chief purpose officer, as Rich sees himself, then that deliberateness is pretty straightforward. And it means being consistent and comprehensive and coherent in your message. So we actually have written some cases about some of our alums. One of my favorite cases is about Genentech up north. Some of you may know Jennifer Cook. And we wrote a case about how quickly she was able to vastly reorient her organizational culture by using exactly the tools that you used to really bring our culture to life at Hans.
Yeah. And she was a student of yours. How did you connect with her?
Isn't there someone here from class of '97? Did I see? Yeah. So do you know Jennifer Cook? Remember Jennifer? Yeah. So she actually, I don't know. I brought her into my office. I offered her some Kool-Aid. Kidding. She was a really interesting case because she was trained as a biologist. She was an undergraduate at Stanford. And she came to Haas for her MBA because she's truly brilliant. And within, I would say, a year of her graduation, she asked me to come down to her first job in Genentech, which was an organization of 15 people. And she said, there's something about how we're kind of operating here, and I think that stuff that you blah, blah, blah in our, leading people class, I think it might be helpful. You talked about this culture. And in every subsequent job, she, brought me in, but really was doing the work herself. I was just, at some point, I just sort of said, why even bother to have me come down? You know this better than I do. But she successively, in each job, figured out how to address the culture issues. And as we both know, she just recently left Genentech to become a CEO of a wonderful pharmaceutical company. So it's really served her very well.
Great,
so,
great.
But let me ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
Because you describe yourself as a student of culture. I actually think you're a culture expert at this point. And I guess it would be interesting to know why, as I said in the film, I think this is one of your most important legacies as dean. There are many, but this is a big one that I think is going to last and has served the school so well and will continue to do so. What led you to be inspired to think about culture as a solution to the opportunities or challenges that we were facing in the school?
Thanks for that. I mentioned I'm an economist. I think you are geared, if you are trained the way I am, to think about incentives and decision rights and structure, and that's where human behavior comes from, and that's how you manage organizations. Things like shared norms and values is not taught in graduate school in economics, right? It's just sort of not where economists come from. And so I think, even when I became acting dean, when Tom Campbell served California, if you recall, as our director of finance, I was acting dean that year. It was 2005. And once I was in that seat, you start looking around and you start realizing this organization is not just about decision rights, and it's not just about incentives. Those things matter. But what it felt like, at least in terms of heading toward getting better, it felt like it was more in this space to me. Now, I didn't quite know what that looked like then, and we didn't launch anything back then, and I was in the role for 1 year. But I think I could see it. There was an opportunity in that space and less of an opportunity over here in the way that I was trained. And then the real breakthrough for me was when, after I stepped down, when Tom came back, I had 2 years of leave at Goldman Sachs. And I was doing education there. So they had a role called Chief Learning Officer, and it was mostly about leadership development and so forth. But as in that role, I was in a unit called Human Capital Management, HR, all right? But I was also on the operating committee of HCM. And so I got to see how the culture was managed. I was sort of in the operating room, if you will, of the management of culture in a big company like that. And it is a company that takes culture very seriously. And so it's the first time I saw intentionality around culture. And I thought, wow, they are not kidding around here, right? I got to work on a project called the Top 5 Culture Shocks experienced by an outside hire managing director. And that was good old-fashioned ethnographic research, day-in-the-life research. We were interviewing people that were 3 to 6 months in from Citibank or Name Your Bank and asking them, why is it so hard to acculturate here? And it was fascinating. So my eyes were wide open at that point. I got an opportunity to come back to Berkeley in 2008 into my job, this current job, and I literally went on the website, and I went on the Berkeley Haas website, and I searched our website for core values, principles, culture. Nothing there. Nothing codified. Sort of like, I just came from a place that is profoundly intentional about culture, and I come back to a place that I knew well, but we had never codified anything. We were not being intentional about it. We had a culture, every organization does, but it was latent. And that was when the light bulb went off. It was sort of like, we have a big opportunity here. And that's when we kind of, it felt like it was time to go for it. Yeah.
So, so we had this opportunity to write the case together. What have been some of the surprises as we've been doing that research? And
well, first of all, the case really started from a question, because Jenny, wherever we were talking, she said, so what are you going to do in this your final year, anticipating the succession, to keep the culture strong? Like, kind of an obvious question, but I hadn't asked myself that question. It's a really important question, right? There is a succession coming. If we aren't intentional about it, the culture will dissipate. That's kind of a given. So it was just such a powerful question for me. And then not long after that, as we were discussing it, you said we should write a case. And that's exactly, for those of you that have a copy of the case, there are copies of them out there. That's the question of the case. Paragraph 2 says, you're the dean, you're looking out the window, you're happy about how things have gone, it's your last year, but what do you do in your last year to keep the culture strong through a transition? That's the question. And then you start thinking about, so anyways, that was really helpful to me, and I think, that was something I learned. It's sort of like, you called me an expert, but that was a powerful question that an expert would have asked him or herself, and I hadn't asked myself that question yet, so that was eye-opening. Here's another eye-opening piece, is that there were so many ideas that came forward quickly, where it's like, that's a game-changing idea. That's a totally great idea. We might not have thought about that. Let me give you an example. The board, right? Jack Russey was on in the video. He's the chair of our board. But the board is a lot of former CEOs, current CEOs, people that have thought about culture a lot. And Jack made it sound like in the video, Rich brought forward these 4 principles. No, the board was very involved in saying, I wouldn't say it this way, I'd say it that way, this is important, less important. And so they were very involved. Now, here's one of the ideas. Somebody said, why don't you get the board to say now, before the new dean is even announced, that a year into the next dean's tenure, we will do a culture review, a culture audit. We'll see how we did in keeping the culture strong. If the board is happy to do that. But that sends a heck of a message, right? It walks you into the succession with a totally different frame, because the board is watching, and this is something that they take seriously. It's like, great, not a heavy lift right now, changes could by itself change kind of the pathway. So the ideas, and there are many others, but the ideas that came out of the powerful question have been great. Yeah. And so when you think about, that's okay. So when you think about your next step in this area, what is the frontier in this area for those of you that are researchers?
In studying organizations.
In studying organizations and culture, yeah.
Well, there are a couple of different directions that we're taking. There's a big data opportunity to actually look at ratings like Glassdoor ratings, you know what those are, where people rate the quality of a company, and see whether we can unobtrusively sort of catalog cultures of organizations. One of the difficult things about doing culture research empirically, quantitatively, which is my approach, is that you have to go in, you have to get the permission, you have to bother people, right? This isn't sort of an unobtrusive way of getting some information about it. And one of the things that's arising from that computational research, and I'm doing it with one of my wonderful young and upcoming colleagues, Samir Srivastava, is that we're finding that it's really valuable for people not just to have what we call value congruence, that is not just to fit an organization that has the same priorities that they do, but to have something that we call perceptual accuracy. So to actually be a realist about what the culture is within your organization and figure out how to operate within it. So we actually find, if we do a horse race between perceptual accuracy and value congruence-based fit, that people have better career attainment if they're realists.
Oh, interesting.
So it's interesting. It's not as optimistic a story as I would like, because I would like people to be idealistic and change cultures when they can. But it's also the case that you need to read the culture that's in front of you. So that's one direction. One of my other favorite directions, it's a little snarky, but I'll mention it here because it's late at night and we're in Hollywood. I guess it's okay. Which is that we're looking at, we've been doing a lot of research on how CEO personality, leader personality, shapes the culture of the organization. And I think we would all agree that Rich has had a huge impact on the culture at Haas in a fantastic way. The tone and the way people interact with one another and the enthusiasm, it's been really contagious, and he's definitely developed it into the culture. But that actually kind of goes a number of ways. So we find that their CEO personality can impact culture. One of the most high impact personality attributes, and this is going to make you a little bit nervous, is CEO narcissism. And it turns out that narcissistic CEOs kind of wreak havoc on their organizations. They claim more pay for themselves. They differentiate themselves from the top executive team. They are more litigious. They get their organizations into significantly more lawsuits. Those lawsuits are more likely to be extremely expensive and protracted. And worst case scenario, which is our brand new study, is that they create cultures that are lower in collaboration and integrity. And so it's a very sobering kind of finding, the impact that we're seeing. I mean, this is very significant sort of quantitative research over many organizations. And I think it really helps us see, and it turns out that boards of directors are often seduced by narcissistic leaders because they think so big, right? There's often there's a higher proportion of narcissists in CEO jobs. Sorry, no, right? I know we have CEOs in the room, not you guys. But this is a kind of an interesting watch out to make sure that the leaders that we put in place actually have the organization's well-being in front and center in the way that Rich did. You know, our head of the advisory board said that you were a servant leader. That's the opposite of a leader. So those are just a couple of directions.
Those are neat. Those are neat. Those are really neat. You know, one of the things in this area, just a quick story, when we think about sort of the best advice we ever got in our lives. And one piece of wonderful advice that I got around culture came from, I think it was Kevin Brown. He's one of our alums. He said, you know, when you're thinking about a culture strategy or any kind of strategy, right, it is still helpful to use that age-old lens of a USP, a unique selling proposition. And so he drew 3 circles. Circle 1, circle 2, partly overlapping, circle 3, so there's a triple overlap in the middle, right? He said, that first circle I drew, right, that's true, right? A unique selling proposition, you want it to be true. Circle 2, valued. Is it true? Is it valued? And then the third one is it different? True, valued, and different. And he said, if you can find something in the culture space or anywhere else that's in that triple overlap, I think he drew it on a napkin, he started punching, you know, his finger, he was putting his finger on that triple overlap, and he's saying, just keep going for it. Just keep going for it. So in the culture space, you know, it is not so hard to be true or true enough, right? It's not hard to come up with unobjectionable words that are valued. It's hard to be different. It's hard to write down things and say, we stand for this, that your competitors look at and say, I wouldn't or couldn't write that down. Now that's powerful. So, you know, that's part of what we did. We didn't call them core values. We called them defining principles. And by putting that D word in front of it, it allowed us the freedom with our faculty and the rest of our community to write stuff down that was separating competitively. Right? Harvard Business School is absolutely outstanding. No question about it. Harvard Business School is very innovative. No question about it. If Harvard Business School announced tomorrow we're about questioning the status quo, it would be cognitive dissonance, right? It's just not their brand. And so these are not things that every business school would be willing to write down. You know, when we talk about beyond yourself, you might imagine, well, any business school would be comfortable writing that down. Really? Would any business school dean be willing to walk into a room of CEOs of whatever industry and say, officers eat last? That's what we're about. That's how you build trust and followership. Maybe not. Confidence without attitude. True confidence comes without arrogance. We think that's important for leadership. Are all the top business schools going to go out and say, yeah, we don't let anybody through the admission screen who doesn't line up with that? They're not willing to say that. And so that's part of that true, valued, different. And that was part of what I think drove some of the value, I hope. So we have maybe just one more question between us. If you've got one burning, I could come up with one, but what would you?
I guess the one I have for you is, what was the hardest part of the defining leader journey, if you will?
Well, it's still, of course, going on because it's never over. I think part of the headroom for the next team, for our community together, is mapping it even more sharply into behaviors. Right? I mean, it's sort of like, we know what it looks like, and we can come up with examples of it and people that are great exemplars and all of that stuff, right? But for a lot of people, it's sort of like, show me some examples so that I totally get it, right? So, for example, one of the things that we surveyed, you surveyed students. We asked students, like, for example, beyond yourself. All of us think about that a little bit differently, right? But one of the things, when somebody's saying, why should I choose Haas? I just got into Kellogg and Wharton and Haas, and I'm trying to decide, right? What does beyond yourself look like for me? And we could say, literally, you will have students in your class that will do all the reading and synthesize the reading and take the notes and then send those notes to her or his classmates. And you could say, but only 20% of you are going to get A's. That's not the problem I'm trying to solve. So when you are lifting the people around you, that's part of what beyond yourself is. If you care about the development of people around you, you're not trying to push them down to be a little higher. That's part of what beyond yourself is. It changes the educational experience. You will evolve faster in this program because your classmates are like that. And if you ask other business school students whether their classmates act that way, specific behavior, you'll get worried faces. And so that just helps to make it concrete, and we need a lot more of that, I think. Yeah, so that's one of the things. So we're going to open it up now. If you have questions for Jenny or for me or for either of us, can be on culture. Please, in the back there. Oh, we have some microphones as well, I believe. Yeah.
Appreciate your guys' attendance here and obviously your time and coming down to LA. I hope you guys have enjoyed the weather.
Thanks, Chris. Yes.
One of the main things I wanted to ask you about, and I'm sure all of us have dealt with this in the past in various organizations, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, but transition is very important, and I really liked that you touched upon that. And I think that taking us from the depths of this economy that we had in 2008 to where we are today, and navigating that has been amazing. And I feel like the biggest challenge that you and the faculty are going to have is making sure that the transition is held up to the highest possible standard. And in that regard, I'd like to hear a little bit maybe, how the faculty help is going to support you on that, and how you are going to help the faculty make sure that they keep the next dean up to that same high standard.
Why don't you go for it?
So I'm actually the chair of a faculty committee because mainly that's what we do at Berkeley is meet in committees.
But it's an elected faculty. She's elected by her peers to be in this leadership committee. So
it's called the Policy and Planning committee, and we work closely with the dean's office. It's 6 members, and it's usually a wonderfully diverse group of faculty from the Haas School. And that's our major agenda item this year, is to figure out how to support Dean Lyons during this final year and how to anticipate the future and smooth the path for an incoming dean. And there are a number of things that we're thinking about that actually change the structure of the school potentially with regard to sort of faculty issues that reconsider the way we administer research and so forth. So there are a number of ways that we're trying to do it, you know, from an organizational standpoint. I will tell you that people are starting to get pretty nostalgic and sad. It's a really bittersweet moment for the school. I think there isn't a faculty member who wouldn't look back over these 10, 11 years and say, you know, the school is really transformed, and it's because of Rich's leadership. He's been a tremendous leader and a tremendous visionary for the school. And I think what we're really trying to do is, there are a number of people involved in the search. P Squared is actually connecting with the search committee as well. We've also talked to the search firm because we need someone who has the kind of vision and heart to really lead us to our next level of greatness. And it's going to be a very hard act to follow, to be quite honest.
Thanks. Thank you for saying that, Jenny. You know, I mentioned this faculty leadership fund. There are a lot of ideas. We might have said, let's start a fund in this, that, or the other thing, but I literally think this is the most valuable dry powder to support the next dean's success. It really is important for keeping the faculty kind of excited, lined up, wanting to stay, looking forward. The board, there was going to be only one Haas board member on the search committee, and I made sure that there were 2. I felt the board, because the board ultimately, you know, the board, just board contributions to Chew Hall covered almost half of the cost of it. I mean, our board is, it's not just a fundraising board, but they're there for us, and when they're motivated, we're doing well, and when they're not. So I wanted the board to feel like their voice was a little bit larger than it had been in the past in the dean selection. But anyways, we can't be complacent. We got it. There are a lot of fronts that we need to be purposeful on. Why don't we go right here, and then we'll go to Bart. Yep.
Anderson School went private.
Yeah.
Still don't quite understand the mechanics of it, but is that something that Haas is considering, or is it going to stay public?
Yeah. So I'll give. It's a big question and big answer. I won't do it full justice, but you know, one big structural difference between us and Anderson is that we have an undergraduate major. Right? There's a small accounting program at the undergrad level at UCLA, but they don't have an undergraduate major. That's a really big structural difference. Basically, the Haas School has 6 degree programs. Now, I'm going to boast on our behalf a little bit, but 2 of them are ranked number 1 in their category. Our MFE program is number 1. Our part-time MBA is number 1 in its category. All right. Our undergrad program is number 2 or 3. It depends on what year you look at it, but it's right near the top and has been for a long time. Our MBA programs are effectively on what we call a self-supporting program. So they are already privatized. We can charge market prices. We have a lot of flexibility on how we manage our MBA programs. And they're really expensive. So I'm not going to stand up, right? But they're a lot more expensive than if you were there 10 or more years ago than they used to be. So one way to think about that is our MFE program, our full-time MBA, our part-time MBA, and our executive MBA are already privatized in that sense. I mean, UCLA Anderson is still very much part of UCLA, okay? So they're not separate from UCLA. So 4 of our degree programs are already privatized, and our PhD program doesn't make any sense to privatize it in that sense. But our undergraduate program is very much still dialed into the campus. So I think the quick answer is no. Now, what we're constantly trying to do, though, is make sure that the financial model under which we operate gets the incentives right, incents us to do the right thing. And we, rather than going out, because what UCLA did got a lot of exposure, and there were some donors, including the Anderson family, that said, we really like this, and we're going to invest in it. So it's brought, Judy Oland brought in some big gifts with that move. But I think we're doing it more under the radar, and we're getting incentives more and more right with the underlying financial model that applies to our 6-degree programs. That's kind of the modus operandi for us. Question here. Carl. Okay.
One follow-up on that earlier point about transition. The aspect of it, if you go to Chicago Symphony, George Schultz had built this the way you built your first and and George Schultz was looked upon as a potential person who said, I don't want to follow that direction. It will be too difficult. So you put somebody in the person in the class and then you got the job that's worth $1,000. How do we prevent that? Losing the George Schultz name. That's the first one. And the second point is sort of more things to talk about directly, talk about this faculty thing and the dean's speech very much. How do those two differ? And for those of us who distribute, how do we rationalize where we put our direction?
Thanks. So the first question is hard for me to address. I mean, that's an interesting.
Well, can I just say one thing first?
Yeah.
I was on the last two of our dean's search, appointing Laura Tyson and appointing Rich. And I will say that that the pool was difficult to gather in those years. The pool now is fantastic. So because of how successfully the school has advanced itself over the last 10 years, this is a job that people want. So we've hired the university has hired a top-notch search firm that's really doing, I think, an extraordinary job and has canvassed everyone under the sun to ask for nominations. And they really are, from my perspective, very, very terrific. So I'm comforted by those two data points. One, that I think the pool is fantastic, and not that I know who's in the pool necessarily, but in this world you sort of know who the potential players are. But second, that the search firm is terrific, and the search committee is really well conceived and a broad and diverse set of voices on the campus. So from that perspective, at least I'm comforted by that. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking.
The point is making it easy for that person to follow.
Yeah.
That's the hard part.
Yeah.
If the search we can find all the great candidates in the world, making ensuring their success because of following the example is going to be the hard part. How are you dealing with that?
Yeah.
If you thought about that.
Well, so the Faculty Research Fund was just one example. We need to come up with a lot of other things, but I think some of the things. For example, 2 years ago, Berkeley's running, as you know, a big operating deficit, and 2 years ago, the Haas School ran its first significant operating deficit. It was 1% of our operating budget. It wasn't huge, but it was $1.4 million deficit. And last year we cut back on some investments, and we did a lot of things that weren't that easy. Last year, just speaking very frankly with you, on a $150 million budget, we were $7 million in surplus. We had an outstanding year. Now, if those had been reversed, if the dean had been coming into a dean search process with a budget deficit and a campus deficit and other things, so the fact that we have a really stable financial model and that we can start reinvesting again, we did pull back on investment that year, is really helping the pool. Anyways, that too is not a complete answer to your question, but we tried to create conditions that we're going to make this look good. And then very quickly on your second question, sort of, when we think about discretionary funds, at the end of the day, I think of it like high-powered money. It's the annual fund is how I'm able to make 15 or 20 seed investments for really interesting things over the next year versus not. I mean, it's that fundamental. The Faculty Research Fund, because it's labeled that, it sends a different message to the faculty, right? I mean, the faculty can't be sure that the next dean will spend annual fund monies, as important as they are, on things that are of paramount importance to the faculty. So I think they're both important, but right now having a little extra boost in this transition year to the Faculty Leadership Fund is actually especially valuable for all the reasons we just mentioned. Bart.
Yeah, so with respect to diversity on principles, is the selection committee does it embrace diverse principles as a criteria to evaluate candidates, or they really include the
Well, go ahead.
Well, one of the brilliant things that Rich did was after our fateful lunch, where we talked about this year, he had the very important idea to ask the central campus to include in the job search the importance of overseeing the defining principles of the school. And, you know, in addition to the audit that you mentioned that the advisory board is interested in conducting, those are explicit criteria for applicants and, you know, formally being considered by the search committee.
Yeah, it was called out very explicitly. Yeah, and you know, one of the important things too, just to and then we can take one question after this. The you know, cultures are alive, right? They need to live and breathe and evolve, right? And so nobody's saying no, we got to be exactly what we've been doing, right? I mean, but where I see a bunch of potential, I just mentioned, look, if we put a bunch of behaviors under these things without being silly about it, that could be animating, right? I think there's still a lot of headroom in the way we use those 4 defining principles to build relationships with companies, right? This is part of our promise. This is the talent you're hiring. We still have more room to develop that. But if somebody were to come in and say, here are the 4, I'm swapping out those 2, you know, operating at that level, it's like, oh my gosh, you don't need to operate at that level, right? There's so much work to do on evolving the culture if it's something you want to spend a lot of time on. So I think there's still a lot of room to evolve it without changing the fundamentals. Final question in the back here, please. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you again for your service, team. You now have been in the role for over a decade, and you've talked about the importance of culture, and I think all of us in this room can agree that it's tremendously important. But if you were to be the one to be advising the board, setting the policy for how to evaluate success of a new dean, what would the factors be? Rankings, fundraising, faculty hiring. What are the right criteria to judge a dean of a top business school?
Super question. When people ask me, you know, what problem are you trying to solve, right? What is your objective function, to use the economics jargon? Now, at some level, I said it before, this is one of society's most valuable assets. It just is. Right? And so at some level, of course, maximum benefit to California, society, the world is what we're trying to do. But that's not a very operationalizable criterion. When somebody asks me, you know, you're going through a budget exercise, you're making hard choices, what problem are you trying to solve? Here's the way I say it. And I've always said it the same way. I'm trying to maximize the long-term reputation of our school. If we get that right, we will win and keep the best faculty, win and keep the best staff, win the best students. We will get that really important societal work done. So that's really that's the lens through which I would look to answer your question. Now, the fundraising is really important. I mean, when I think about priority, look, all of us, we're overwhelmed by email, right? I could spend all my day doing email. I've started saying, look, Rich, it's okay to be late on email. There are parts of the fundraising only you can do. Don't lose sight of that. So you just, it's like it's a sales role, and I mean that in the very most positive way. 40% of my time is selling to donors. And I like it because I care about the institution. But the fundraising is way up there. And then I think the other thing that's way up there is, you know, how do we competitively separate in ways that are meaningful to us? Not chasing certain things, but it's like, can we separate? That's part of why I was so enthusiastic about the culture, because it felt like that's both our essence It's driving into who we are and aspire to be, and it's competitively separating. So let's go after that. But I think we're up against some terrific institutions. And if we're going to win the best faculty and students and staff, we have to keep thinking about what's the next layer of competitive separation. One of the vision statements we put around culture, and it's in the case, was we will be the most distinguished by culture business school. That's hallowed ground. And some people feel like we're already there. We need more hallowed ground vision statements that we can drive toward, that are competitively separated. That's the direction setting that the dean needs to do. And that will involve our faculty, of course. But those are the two biggies. We got to fund greatness, and we got to see greatness. And we got to do those two things together. I think we have to wrap this part of the session up here. Let's all thank Mark one more time for this wonderful venue. Mark, thank you for that. I want to thank all of you personally. I look out at the faces in this room, and I said it at the beginning, but this has been by far the most satisfying, fulfilling phase of my life. It's an institution we all care about. It matters deeply for the future. It really does. It's one of those institutions that will be shaping things in the right way long after we're gone, which is why we invest so much of our time and effort in it. And I would ask you all to please think even more about how important the role that Berkeley needs to play and Haas needs to play in the future. Right? These types of leaders that we're putting, what does it all add up to? I mean, we talked about the culture as if it is a thing, and it is a thing, but what it adds up to is a different kind of person we're putting into the world. We're shaping people in a different way, a larger way, a more valuable way. And if people are moving just a little bit more toward a perspective of officers eat last, there are times when I need to subordinate my interests to get things done. We've all worked for officers eat first people. Everybody knows what that looks like. You can see it a mile away. And we also know that there's some terrifically successful people in the economy who are not well described by confidence without attitude or beyond yourself, for example. Right? But that's not what this school is about. So let's lean into those things that matter to us. And pardon my language, but God damn it, it is time to take a stand on values. Let's make this institution what we think society needs, which is what we're doing together. And let's keep investing. Keep investing not just financially, right? You're hiring us. You're steering potential applicants our way. We're in this totally together. And of course, your investments in it matter, right? That shoe haul and the other things that make that possible. I'll conclude on this thought. You've heard me say it before. The state of California created this remarkable institution. The alumni made it great. If you stripped out what our alumni have done to make Haas what it is, we wouldn't have those 3 buildings. We wouldn't have the faculty chairs. We wouldn't have the student scholarships. We wouldn't have Chu Hall. We wouldn't have the stuff that's enabled us to do the important work we're doing. So let's continue to lean into that, because that is our future. And we can do even more wonderful work in putting the right kind of people into our future by doing more for Berkeley. Thanks for coming out tonight. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.